Welcome to Living the Bible, where we examine the Bible and church history to guide everyday living. I'm your host, Jason Conrad, and today we're diving into something that might surprise you, something that both Christians and skeptics can agree on. We're talking about the Apostle Paul and 7 letters of his that virtually every scholar, from committed Christians to outspoken atheists, agree he genuinely wrote. They're called the Undisputed letters of Paul, and they've been accepted as authentic for over 150 years. Here's why that's such a big deal. We hold that AD 30 is the date of Jesus' crucifixion. According to Paul's own account in Galatians, his conversion happened between 31 and 33 AD, just 1 to 3 years after the crucifixion. His death likely occurred between 64 or 67 AD, probably in Rome and under the reign of Nero. That means Paul was active in Christian ministry for over 3 decades, and during that time he wrote letters that remain our earliest Christian documents, letters written before any of the Gospels, giving us direct access to the beliefs of the earliest Christians. Even more remarkable, some of the most outspoken atheist and agnostic scholars alive today, these are people who reject miracles, deny the resurrection, they're critical of Christianity. They still agree that Paul wrote these 7 letters. Here's a couple examples. Bart Ehrman, an agnostic and atheist scholar and one of the most well-known New Testament critics today, affirms the authenticity of these 7 letters. He writes, quote, "There is no doubt that Paul wrote Galatians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon." Another, Richard Carrier, a vocal atheist and a mythicist, he doesn't even think Jesus really existed. Even he accepts these 7 letters of Paul as genuine. He writes, quote, "The 7 letters generally agreed upon as authentic," and then he lists out the same 7, "are sufficient to reconstruct the basic outline of Paul's theology and missionary activity." That kind of agreement is rare. It means these letters aren't just church tradition. They're historical artifacts affirmed by both believing Christians and critical atheist, agnostic scholars. Let's walk through these letters in the order that most scholars believe they were written. First is Galatians, written somewhere between 48 and 50 AD. This is Paul's defense of the gospel of grace. It contains one of the most important autobiographical sections in the New Testament. Paul lays out 17 years of timeline details. In Galatians chapters 1 and 2, he recounts his conversion, his early isolation, and later meetings with Peter and James in Jerusalem. When you work backward from his travel to Jerusalem and the dates of this letter, Paul's conversion lands within 1 to 3 years of Jesus' death. It could even be earlier than that. This makes Galatians a crucial first-person source from someone deeply connected to the first-generation Christian movement. Next comes 1st Thessalonians, written again somewhere around 50 AD. It's a general letter of encouragement to a young church. Then 1 Corinthians, written around 54 AD. This is another super important one. Paul addresses the division and immorality and confusion in this church, but this letter contains 4 very important elements. In chapter 15, it's the early Christian creed summarizing Jesus' death, his burial, his resurrection, and his appearances to people, likely formed within a few years of the crucifixion event. This letter also has 3 clear references to Jesus' teachings found in the Gospels. Now again, the atheist and agnostic scholarly consensus is that the Gospels were written at the earliest 70 AD and then later, whereas we know 1 Corinthians written around 54, prior to the writing of the Gospels. Yet there's 3 examples in the book of 1 Corinthians that's referencing gospel content. So there's the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 23. Paul recounts the Lord's Supper event, which is very similar to what you see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then on the topic of divorce in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 10, very similar to what you see in Jesus' teaching in Mark and Luke. And then the idea of supporting ministers who are preaching the gospel in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, very similar to what Jesus says in Luke chapter 10. None of it is verbatim. None of it is like copied from the gospels, but the content is so similar you can't miss it. So what it shows you is that Jesus's words, the content of the gospels, were already there, already in circulation, already known before even the formal gospels were written later, like in 70 AD. Then there's 2 Corinthians, written around 55 or 56 AD. Then Romans, 56 to 57 AD. And then Philippians, around 60 AD, is written. And this one is a prison letter, written from prison. Important in this letter of Philippians is chapter 2, starting in verse 6. Many scholars call this the Christ hymn. Paul's quoting an already existing creed or hymn used in early Christian worship. It describes Jesus' divine nature, his incarnation, his obedience, his death, his exaltation, showing that the earliest Christians were already worshiping Jesus as Lord just decades after his crucifixion, probably earlier. This passage gives us a glimpse into the pre-gospel Christian belief and shows that Paul inherited rather than invent this high view of Jesus. And then finally is the letter to Philemon, written 60 to 61, again from prison. And it's a short, very powerful letter to show how the gospel changes people's lives and how it transforms relationships. These 7 letters are the earliest Christian literature we have, written before any of the 4 Gospels. Yet even in these early writings, Paul is already quoting sayings of Jesus. He's referencing events like the Last Supper. He's drawing on creeds and hymns and theological themes that were already in circulation. That means Paul wasn't inventing Christianity. He was handing down what the church already believed and taught, sometimes within just a few years of the crucifixion itself. So even the earliest documents we have are repeating and preserving and confirming the message and memory of Jesus that would later be written down in story form in the Gospels. So when you open Galatians or Romans or Philippians, you're not just reading theology, you're reading history. You're hearing the voice of a man who helped shape Christianity from the very beginning, as early as within 1 year of the crucifixion event itself. Thanks for joining me today. If this episode helps you see the historical reliability of the New Testament more clearly, please subscribe, give us a review, give us some comments, and let's stay grounded in the Scripture.